They say the truth will set you free, but sometimes the truth is a weapon that can destroy everything in its path. My name is Jonathan Pierce, and this is the story of how I used my investigative journalism skills to uncover the most devastating story of my career, the betrayal of my own wife. I'm 39 years old, an investigative journalist who has spent the last 15 years exposing corruption, fraud, and abuse of power for the Washington Herald, one of the most respected newspapers in the country. My specialty is long-form investigative pieces that require months of research, careful documentation, and the ability to uncover hidden connections that others miss. I've won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for my work exposing political corruption and corporate malfeasance. The story begins with what I thought was the perfect partnership, both personal and professional. I met Rebecca 8 years ago when she was working as a communications director for a major nonprofit organization focused on government transparency. She was brilliant, passionate about social justice, and seemed to share my commitment to holding powerful people accountable for their actions. Rebecca wasn't just beautiful. She was intellectually formidable. She had a law degree from Harvard and a master's in public policy from Georgetown. She understood the complexities of government and politics, and she was an invaluable sounding board for my investigative work. She could spot legal vulnerabilities in my stories, suggest new angles for investigation, and help me understand the broader implications of the corruption I was exposing. We married after 3 years of dating, and for the first 5 years of our marriage, we seemed like the ideal power couple in Washington's political journalism scene. Rebecca had moved on from the nonprofit world to become a senior communications strategist for a prestigious consulting firm that worked with political campaigns and advocacy organizations. I continued building my reputation as one of the most feared investigative journalists in the city. Rebecca was particularly supportive during my most challenging investigations. When I was working on stories that involved powerful people who could make my life difficult, she provided both emotional support and strategic advice. When sources were reluctant to talk, she helped me understand their motivations and develop approaches that would make them more comfortable sharing information. She seemed to understand that investigative journalism wasn't just a job. It was a mission to protect democracy by exposing the truth. But what I didn't realize was that Rebecca's understanding of my work was being used against me in ways I never could have imagined. The first sign that something was wrong came during my investigation of a major defense contracting scandal. I'd been working for months to expose how a consortium of defense contractors had been overcharging the Pentagon for military equipment while providing substandard products that put soldiers' lives at risk. It was exactly the kind of story that had made my reputation: complex, important, and requiring careful documentation to prove wrongdoing. But as I got closer to publication, I started encountering unusual obstacles. Sources who had been cooperative suddenly became evasive. Documents that should have been available through Freedom of Information Act requests were being delayed or heavily redacted. People who had agreed to go on the record were changing their minds and refusing to be quoted. At first, I assumed this was normal pushback from powerful interests who didn't want their corruption exposed. Defense contractors have significant resources and political connections, and they're not shy about using them to protect themselves from negative publicity. But the pattern of obstruction seemed too coordinated, too well-informed about the specific details of my investigation. More troubling was what I began to notice about Rebecca's behavior during this period. She was asking more detailed questions about my investigation than usual, wanting to know about specific sources, particular documents, and the timeline for publication. When I mentioned the obstacles I was encountering, she seemed unusually interested in the details of who was blocking my access to information and how they were doing it. Rebecca had also started traveling more frequently for work, often with very short notice. She was receiving phone calls at odd hours that she would take privately in another room. She had begun working late more often, claiming that her consulting firm was taking on more high-profile clients who required intensive strategic support. But the breakthrough came when I discovered something that made my investigative instincts scream that something was very wrong. I was looking for some research materials in Rebecca's home office when I found a folder containing detailed information about my defense contracting investigation. Not just general information that I might have shared with her in casual conversation, but specific details about sources, documents, and investigative strategies that I had never discussed with anyone outside my editor and the newspaper's legal team. Rebecca had been systematically documenting my investigative process, including the names of confidential sources, the content of sensitive documents, and the specific allegations I was planning to make in my story. She had detailed notes about which sources were most vulnerable to pressure, which documents were most damaging to the defense contractors, and which aspects of my investigation were most likely to result in criminal charges. At first, I thought this might be related to her consulting work. Perhaps she was trying to understand how investigative journalism worked so she could better advise her clients about managing negative publicity. But as I dug deeper into the files, I realized something much more sinister was happening. Rebecca had been using my investigative information to help the very people I was trying to expose. She'd been working with someone, I didn't yet know who, to provide advance warning about my investigation, allowing the defense contractors to prepare their defenses, pressure my sources, and obstruct my access to crucial information. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the back of the folder was correspondence between Rebecca and someone named David Kellerman, who appeared to be both her business partner in this betrayal and her lover. The emails detailed not just their efforts to sabotage my investigation, but also their personal relationship and their plans for the future. David was a high-powered attorney who specialized in representing defense contractors and other corporations facing government investigations. Rebecca had been providing him with inside information about my investigation, allowing his clients to stay one step ahead of my reporting and minimize the damage from any eventual story. The personal emails between Rebecca and David were even more devastating than the professional betrayal. They'd been having an affair for over a year, and they were planning to leave their respective spouses and start a new life together using the money David was making from his defense contractor clients. But what made the betrayal even more painful was how they talked about me in their correspondence. David referred to me as the Bloodhound, someone whose investigative skills were useful for identifying potential problems, but who was too naive to realize he was being manipulated. Rebecca called me Jonathan the Crusader, suggesting that my commitment to exposing corruption made me easy to exploit because I trusted people who claimed to share my values. They were planning to continue their sabotage until David's clients were safe from prosecution, at which point Rebecca would divorce me and they would start their new life together, leaving me to face the professional consequences of failed investigations and burned sources. In other words, Rebecca wasn't just cheating on me. She was using my investigative work, my sources, and my professional reputation as tools to help corrupt defense contractors escape accountability for putting soldiers' lives at risk. That's when I realized I needed to investigate Rebecca and David with the same thoroughness and precision that I brought to my professional work. I spent the next month conducting a comprehensive investigation of Rebecca and David's activities, using the same methodical approach I applied to exposing political corruption. As someone trained to follow money trails, identify hidden connections, and document patterns of wrongdoing, I was uniquely qualified to uncover the full scope of their betrayal. I discovered that Rebecca and David had been running a sophisticated operation to protect defense contractors from negative publicity and government investigation. Rebecca would use her access to my work to identify potential threats, while David would coordinate legal and political responses to minimize damage. They were essentially selling advanced intelligence about investigative journalism to corporations that wanted to avoid accountability. But their operation went beyond just my investigations. Rebecca had been cultivating relationships with other journalists, activists, and government officials, gathering intelligence about potential threats to David's clients from multiple sources. She was using her reputation as a communication strategist and her connections in the transparency advocacy community to identify and neutralize threats to corporate interests. In several cases, they had successfully derailed investigations that could have exposed serious wrongdoing. Sources had been intimidated into silence, documents had been destroyed or hidden, and journalists had been discredited or distracted with false leads. They were essentially running a counterintelligence operation designed to protect corporate corruption from exposure. But Rebecca and David had made a critical error in their planning. They had underestimated my investigative skills and my commitment to protecting my sources. As someone who had spent 15 years exposing corruption, I understood exactly how their operation worked, and I knew how to gather evidence that would prove their wrongdoing beyond any reasonable doubt. More importantly, they had underestimated my understanding of the legal and ethical systems they were violating. Interfering with journalistic investigations, intimidating sources, and obstructing government oversight constitutes serious criminal activity that could result in federal charges for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of whistleblower protection laws. I decided to let Rebecca and David continue their activities while I built a comprehensive case against them. I wanted them to commit fully to their criminal enterprise before I revealed that I knew what they were doing. I wanted them to create an undeniable pattern of illegal activity that would ensure they faced serious legal consequences for their actions. Over the next few weeks, I watched Rebecca accelerate her intelligence gathering, becoming more aggressive in her attempts to access information about my work and more frequent in her communications with David. She was becoming increasingly confident that her operation was working and that I was too focused on my investigations to notice what was happening. Meanwhile, I was quietly documenting every aspect of their criminal operation. I was making copies of their correspondence, tracking their financial transactions, and building relationships with FBI agents who specialized in public corruption cases. I was also consulting with media law attorneys to understand exactly how Rebecca and David's activities violated federal laws protecting journalistic freedom and source confidentiality. The confrontation came when Rebecca and David attempted to execute what they thought would be their biggest success, completely derailing my defense contracting investigation by having one of my key sources arrested on fabricated charges. They had convinced David's clients to file a false criminal complaint against a Pentagon whistleblower who had provided me with crucial documents about the substandard military equipment. They were planning to have the source arrested for theft of government property, which would discredit his testimony and make it impossible for me to use the documents he had provided. But I had been expecting this move, and I was ready with my own strategy. Instead of waiting for the arrest to happen, I proactively contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit to report the conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. I presented them with comprehensive documentation of Rebecca and David's operation, including copies of their correspondence, evidence of their financial arrangements, and proof of their systematic efforts to interfere with government oversight. I also contacted the Pentagon's Inspector General to report the attempt to intimidate a whistleblower and provided them with evidence that the criminal complaint against my source was fabricated as part of a broader effort to obstruct investigation of defense contractor fraud. But I wasn't finished. I had also been working on the biggest investigative story of my career, an exposé of Rebecca and David's entire operation and its impact on government accountability. I had documented how their conspiracy had allowed defense contractors to escape prosecution for fraud that had cost taxpayers millions of dollars and put soldiers' lives at risk. The arrests came on a Thursday morning while Rebecca was at work and David was meeting with defense contractor clients. They were both charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, interference with federal investigations, and violation of whistleblower protection laws. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and they had no choice but to accept plea agreements that included significant prison sentences. But the legal consequences were only part of my response. I also published a comprehensive investigative story about their operation, detailing how corporate interests had infiltrated the transparency advocacy community and corrupted the very people who were supposed to be protecting government accountability. The story won a Pulitzer Prize and led to significant reforms in how government oversight investigations are protected from corporate interference. More satisfying than the legal victories or professional recognition was the impact on the defense contracting investigation that Rebecca and David had tried to sabotage. Without their interference, I was able to complete my reporting and publish a story that led to criminal charges against several defense contractor executives and significant reforms in Pentagon procurement practices. 6 months later, I'm continuing to practice investigative journalism with the same dedication and precision that has defined my career. The experience with Rebecca and David taught me valuable lessons about protecting sources and recognizing attempts to compromise journalistic independence, knowledge that I now share with other journalists through professional training programs. Rebecca is serving a 4-year prison sentence for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. David received a 6-year sentence due to his leadership role in the criminal enterprise and his violation of attorney ethics rules. Several of the defense contractors they had protected are now facing federal charges for fraud and endangering military personnel. The most satisfying aspect of this experience wasn't the legal consequences or the professional recognition. It was the demonstration that journalistic integrity and commitment to truth ultimately triumph over corporate manipulation and personal betrayal. Rebecca and David had tried to exploit the trust that exists between journalists and sources, but their scheme collapsed because that trust was built on a foundation of genuine commitment to exposing corruption and protecting democracy. My response proved that investigative journalists have both the skills and the responsibility to protect their sources from intimidation, even when that intimidation comes from people they trust personally. The investigative techniques that Rebecca had tried to use against me became the tools I used to expose her criminal activities and protect the sources she had targeted. But the real lesson of this experience was about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and protecting the confidential information that sources entrust to journalists. Rebecca's betrayal was possible because I had been too trusting with sensitive information and too willing to share details about my work with someone whose interests weren't aligned with my professional obligations. The safeguards I implemented after discovering Rebecca's activities: enhanced security for source communications, stricter protocols for information sharing, and better monitoring of who has access to sensitive investigative materials, weren't just protective measures. They were professional responsibilities that I should have been maintaining all along. Rebecca thought she could exploit my commitment to exposing corruption and my trust in our marriage to build a criminal enterprise that protected the very people I was trying to hold accountable. But she had fundamentally misunderstood what drives ethical journalism. She had focused on the information-gathering process while ignoring the moral obligations and professional integrity that make investigative reporting possible. My revenge wasn't about destroying Rebecca's life or seeking personal satisfaction from her punishment. It was about protecting my sources from intimidation, maintaining the integrity of investigative journalism, and ensuring that people who interfere with government accountability face appropriate consequences for their actions. The investigation I conducted into Rebecca and David wasn't just about exposing their betrayal. It was about demonstrating that the same skills used to expose political corruption can be used to protect journalistic freedom from those who would compromise it for personal gain. Sometimes the most important story is the one that protects your ability to tell all the other stories. By exposing Rebecca and David's operation, I prevented them from sabotaging other investigations and helped strengthen the systems that protect journalistic independence from corporate interference. The betrayal that was meant to destroy my career actually strengthened it, because it forced me to demonstrate my commitment to journalistic ethics in ways that wouldn't have been necessary if Rebecca had remained trustworthy. Her criminal activities became the catalyst for improvements in source protection and investigative security that will benefit the journalism community for years to come. In the end, Rebecca learned that you can exploit trust temporarily, but you can't build a sustainable criminal enterprise on the foundation of someone else's professional integrity. The sources she tried to intimidate trusted me because I had earned that trust through years of protecting their identities and using their information responsibly. When forced to choose between her manipulation and my documented track record of ethical journalism, they chose the reporter who had actually protected them. The investigation was complete. Justice, documented with the same precision and thoroughness that I bring to every story that matters.